that was new. Anyway, now for the SGW3 video that absolutely none of you have been waiting for, but I was. Since it's been, Jesus Christ, more than a year since I released my pilot episode on CI Games' first AA game, let's just quickly recap their journey to not be a complete laughingstock that I relentlessly obsess over for some dumb reason. The aforementioned game was the first Sniper Ghost Warrior, a stealth sniping game with broken stealth, somewhat broken sniping, and forced unwelcome combat sections that were so painful and occupy so much of my trauma-laden memories of that wretched piece of crap that it tricked me into thinking that the second game was actually decent. Sniper Ghost Warrior 2 may not be the worst game in CI's AA lineup, but I definitely have the biggest personal grudge against it. As all of my little edits to my Steam review, chapter titles, description, my last two videos, and a pinned comment blatantly state, I really should not have been so nice to it. Seriously, that video aged worse than my first one. Even if I still think the atmosphere's good, the sniping satisfying, and even the voice acting good quality, it does not overwrite the garbage tier, hand-holdy level design as much as I suggested. Honestly, if it didn't have 100 views and if I didn't have shitty internet, I would have taken it down and fixed it. It's stupidly overrated, relatively, practically plays itself, and I definitely caution against it. Siberian Strike is less embarrassing at least. My previous video covered Alien Molding, CI's brief foray into the more arcadey, less grounded run-and-gun FPSs. While it had smooth and decently enjoyable gunplay and very pretty graphics, it was seriously let down by frustrating difficulty spikes that ruined the whole thing. After that, they released Enemy Front, a World War II FPS with a focus on open levels and player agency. While it did occasionally drop the ball with weak level design that even devolves into Spunk Gargle Wee Wee, some of the better maps, I think, did show some promise from CI, and the general ethos of the game at large would come to define all their following titles, especially SGW3. Oh yeah, there was also Lords of the Fallen, a Dark Soulsian type game they released in 2014 in collaboration with Deck 13 Interactive that I neglected to mention in other videos. I never played it, and frankly it's a little outside this channel's focus, so yeah. Critical scores are surprisingly okay, but the public didn't seem to like it. Despite all these games having middling success at best, our Polish pals somehow managed to shore up enough money to fund a full-fledged AAA project. And what better way to invest that money than by making a new entry in your most popular franchise? And you know, finally try to make it good. Initially announced in 2014, CI really did splurge on SGW3's development. Compared to their previous titles, it was certainly a glow up in terms of ambition and scope. Instead of copying COD's stealth missions and stretching them across a shit campaign, they basically copied all of Far Cry, more or less. Yes, it's still just trend chasing, but it's no doubt a massive undertaking, especially for these guys. Regardless, it was gonna have just about everything it needed to cater to the amorphous blob that was the general gaming audience at the time, rightfully tossing away the Spunk Gargle Wee Wee shtick in favor of
a vast open world, expanding player agency, dozens of main and side missions to complete, Coomer
the works, really. However, the development cycle truly did put the in AAA. Thanks to a modder responsible for the unofficial patch that I'll address later, I was able to find some forum posts on, hear me out, Reset Era, from a level artist known as Preglick that worked on SGW3 who details the hardships that had occurred during their time there. With things allegedly going tits up around late 2015 and early 2016, it's a classic case of raw talent and passion being grossly mishandled. It seems like it was a long and painful journey, which gave the rest of the gaming industry plenty of time to make sure everyone would become really fucking tired of this open world shit by the time it would drop. They state, "We knew the direction the game was taking, but we were just artists or programmers with no power to influence the game's direction. Lots of us left before completion, and even more were fired at launch. The workplace was toxic, and directors and leads were impulsively adding stuff. The story went through a number of rewrites after CI CEO and the writer, Paul Robinson, had a falling out, leaving behind what most considered to be a mangled husk of the original plot. Many ideas and features were modified and implemented in a different way than originally intended. Performance issues were known, but couldn't be fixed. NPC-driven vehicles were cut because they straight up didn't work. Would have been a riot though. Entire maps were cut, including almost a year's worth of Praglick's work. Crunch. The CEO wanted The Witcher 3 and we got Cyberpunk 2077. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but what I read was so heartbreaking I feel kinda bad about some of the criticisms that I'll be tossing around. I'm not mad, I'm just desperately making sure I don't look like a biased shill. The game finally flopped out seemingly stillborn in late April 2017, which, to make matters worse, was shortly after Sniper Elite 4. Lovely. All that money, blood, sweat, and tears didn't pay off. SGW3 received the same middling reception across the board like all their other games, with people griping about its lack of originality, general dislike of the open world, and as always, technical issues. Yahtzee even dubbed it as the worst game of the year. You can turn the red dot off, you hack! Do I dare compare the Metacritic scores again? Oh yes! Yes! Suck it! At this point, I think it's somewhat obvious what my contrarian ass thinks of it. In spite of the laundry list of problems it has, I still really like it, and I strongly believe it got way more shit than it really deserved. It's not the best game in the series, technically speaking, that award goes to Contracts, but SGW3 is probably my favorite of the bunch for rather sentimental reasons. While it obviously helps that it's a damn sight better than 1 or 2 as a game, and if you're one of those people who disagrees, I'm not sure we can be friends. This was actually the first CI game that I ever played and was a bit of a coping comfort game during a particularly hard time in my life, if you can believe it. If you add up those playthroughs plus the one I did for this video and one that was cut short by a mod that I'll talk about later, I played the base game no less than 3.25 times. If you also take into account my compulsive desires to 100% it, I have willingly logged more hours in SGW3 than any rational human being realistically should, and enjoyed it. So I like to think I know the game well enough, although I am a total cretin. At a glance, SGW3's story is still mostly your average modern military schlock. This time around, you play as John North and... okay, I'm just gonna do a dramatic reading of his bio and you can write your own jokes.
John North is a loyal soldier. He believes in the classical American way of life and strongly identifies with the notion of America being the world police. As a Marine and a sniper, he learned to trust his own instincts in distinguishing good and evil, and never hesitates to state his mind to others. Natural leader with craving for control.
What can I say? It speaks for itself. By the way, the dialogue in this game can equally be as bad. It can get very silly, but it feels less tongue-in-cheek and more the writer unironically thought this sounded cool.
About 1,500 dead. I've got 1,500 George and Laurie.
That's what, 40 cents to the dollar?
I'd like to nail the bills to that son of a bitch's chest and write payment for Borjami across his face.
Yeah, that would make it crystal clear. Did you kill innocent civilians? You got a price on your head.
What about the ICC?
This is American justice. Shoot first, ask questions later.
Whoever's leading them is one kick-ass motherfucker. Oh, did I mention crazy smart and feared like a god?
So we need to sow a little good old-fashioned disruption and chaos in amongst these troublemakers. Show them what it really means to be feared like a god.
Stealth and awe. Stealth and awe.
Anyway, in the prologue, John and his equally burly younger brother Robert are sent to the Russian-Ukrainian border to take care of some bioweapons. They succeed, but then they're immediately apprehended by some unknown soldiers, with Robert being captured and John just being left on the ground. I guess, because he's perfectly fine 2 years later. John's now in Georgia alongside his handler Frank, Georgian ex-Spec Ops and former lover Lydia, and Mossad agent Raquel to break up a supposedly suspiciously stacked separatist cell doing your typical horribly bad things, and the US cares about this for some reason because world police. There's at least a little more to the premise to soften the propaganda. Apparently, John caught wind that Robert just so happened to be in the area as well because, of course he is, so he wants to find him. Huh, little brother fucks up, so the older one's gotta save him. Relatable. A bit like the last game, the story starts with a lot of military busywork before the story develops in all kinds of weird ways later on, so I'd be remiss not to talk about it in some capacity. We'll save it for later. Delving into the technical aspects, I'd firstly like to bring up the SGW3 unofficial patch I mentioned earlier because I consider it basically essential to play the game. Not like it's unplayable without it, but it fixes a wide variety of oddities, most notably the broken day-night cycle that would perpetually reset reset the clock to midnight. There's still issues with reloading checkpoints though, and embarrassingly fixes an issue where enemies had a tendency to disappear after 250 meters. To be fair, most of your encounters won't exceed this distance, but still, there's no reason to not use it. However, bear in mind that this still won't make the game completely squeaky clean. I imagine there was only so much the modder could have done. By the way, do not enable the Phantom Gadget icon fix. Worst mistake of my life. Normally, this fixes an odd issue with the game's HUD that shows the icon for one item, only for it to actually be something different or nothing at all. Seems harmless, but it had the nasty side effect of wiping all of my money and crafting materials when I finished Act 1 in a previous playthrough, hence why I said I played this game 3¼ times. I also won't be using any of the Improvement Project additions here. Some of the changes move the game a little too far from the vanilla experience or aren't to my taste, so to keep things simple we'll leave them out, yeah? Running on CryEngine 4 this time around, SGW3's graphics are best described as a high amplitude sine wave, with the game often switching between drop-dead gorgeous and kinda ugly and flat. Huh, a bit like my DeviantArt page. During the peaks, the things that stand out to me the most are the lighting and color palette, both usually being so good at making an impressionist artist swoon. During the day through to early evenings, objects, especially trees, cast these really nice dynamic shadows. The sun has the perfect amount of bloom so it's bright without being overbearing. Really, the way everything is rendered can make the game look, and here's that buzzword again, photorealistic. And oh man, the colors! Greens, blues, oranges, yellows, purples, reds, they're all combined in different ways and quantities and change throughout the day, creating amazingly vibrant and beautiful landscapes that I don't think has been matched elsewhere. I often found myself just stopping to take in the views and finding my happy place.
Everything's nice here.
Things aren't quite as mystical during nighttime since the colors are reduced to being mostly blue and green, and the moon doesn't have the same awe-inspiring impact on the environment, but it can still look pretty good. The rain and snow effects also look great and create a fantastic harsh atmosphere, so it's a shame they only seem to trigger during like 3 missions. Now for the valleys, which are at times uncanny.
Fuck!
Yeah, the character models are a little off to me. A lot of them have a weird, soft focus, clay-like quality that looks dated and ugly as hell. The cutscenes usually don't fare much better either. Another issue with the visuals is that things in the distance, just like the first game, are mostly a murky, muddy, monochromatic mess. I guess you could say it's like an atmospheric fog effect, which can work in some areas and times of day, like in strong moon or sunlight, but other times it just washes everything out, hurts readability and clarity, and looks like Morrowind. Sometimes it almost looks like you're floating in an empty skybox since these backdrops are completely devoid of detail.
God forbid it goes sour.
You'll also have some areas or times of day where neither the sun nor moon are really present, so you'll see how much the visuals suffer without good lighting. Overall though, I'd be lying if I said these blunders ruin the awe-inspiring moments. I can't think of too many other games that have views that make me feel the way I do about these, but it is definitely a mixed bag. On a more positive note, I really love the music, which was composed by Mikołaj Strawinski, who had previously done work on none other than The Witcher 3. Boy, name a bigger downgrade. Even though its implementation is rather bungled, they only seem to play during missions, otherwise you get nothing, and sometimes stops playing if you reload a checkpoint like you're playing Half-Life, the music that usually plays as you're sneaking around is equal parts calming and suspenseful. He also composed the pieces of Georgian music that play on the radio as you drive around. It's all very nice to listen to and makes your commutes a bit more pleasant. One of them is even used as the best main menu track ever, which I used in the intro, and it's a real slapper that you'll have plenty of time to listen to as you wait for the game to load. Yeah, I'm running this on an SSD, and while it's not a Samsung brand, I don't think it should take me a solid minute to load in, and it was even worse before patches. You'll only have to sit through this when you start the game or switch between regions, but it's worth mentioning. Speaking of slow, the performance is a little shaky. I built my rig only a few months before the game came out, and on average, I was fluctuating between 45 and 60 FPS on high settings, with occasional dips into the 30s. It also has a habit of freezing occasionally when walking around as the assets load in. It's not bad enough to make the game unplayable if you consider the slow pace, but it's important to note. Moving on to the gameplay, I want to quickly address the difficulty settings. The differences between normal and hard are about what you'd expect, with tougher enemies and no regenerating health for the latter. As for the challenge difficulty, it gives you the option to disable most of your HUD elements, as well as only letting you see enemy tags while using the drone. Otherwise, you'll have to memorize the patrols and positions yourself. It'll also prevent you from using certain skills. However, it's worth noting that, according to my tests, enemies aren't any more deadly and won't one-shot you as the description suggests. So the game isn't really much harder so much as it's just slowed down, so I didn't bother. And yes, HUD customization does vary by difficulty because that totally makes sense. Sniping has seen some moderate changes since the last installment. They aren't bad, but it's generally a touch on the easier side. The first thing you'll likely notice is that I'm barely adjusting my aim vertically thanks to the new elevation adjustment feature. I'm pretty mixed on this. I don't hate its inclusion, and it does make you feel like a sniper, but it really just boils down to matching the elevation value to the range value. In a way, you could say that half the challenge is basically gone. You can't really ignore it either since your reticle changes with every new scope you unlock. Look, I may have pedantically discussed scopes in the past, but if you think I'm analyzing all of this, sorry. Compensating for wind is also significantly less vague this time around. Simply put, all you really need to do is to line up your target directly underneath the red tick, and that's it. Unless your target is far away, it's somewhat unlikely you'll miss. Don't get me wrong, you'll still need to take a somewhat measured approach to sniping compared to the average FPS. There's still a margin of error, so I find it fun and satisfying enough. However, the reduced vagueness and thus challenge does take away some of the uncertainty and tension that made SGW2 still objectively terrible, but palatable unless you're firing from over 400 meters away, which is rare. Some new additions include bipods, different calibers, and, more interestingly, various special ammo types with different functions. Bipods are obvious. Provided your rifle can equip one, it allows you to mount up on objects or on the ground to stabilize your aim. Without one, you can only mount up on chest-high walls, which doesn't help your stability nearly as much. As for the calibers, they determine how powerful your rifle is, with 7.62 being the weakest, followed by 3.38, then obviously 50 cal. Why am I stating the obvious besides being a pedant? Well, according to a Steam guide that, in fact, I wrote just before the world ended, it's because the weapon stat bars are completely, utterly fucked and are not to be trusted. Pardon me as I more or less regurgitate what I had written. It's not plagiarism, right? The best demonstration of this is the difference in the listed damage values between the starter rifle, the XM 2015, and one of the last rifles you might unlock, the ES-25. As you can see, despite both being chambered in 7.62, the ES's damage stats surpasses the 3.38 rifles to be on par with a fucking 50 cal, leaving the XM in the dust. However, when testing them against the same enemy type, the shots to kill are identical. Why is this? Well, according to a certain Trogdor, who, judging by their post history and supposedly their Steam page when it wasn't private, is an actual CI dev or at least someone very familiar with the game. I quote, "The damage bar actually shows damage per second, so if the 7.62 rifle has a quicker bolt action and a bigger mag, then it might show up as having more power." Setting aside the fact that displaying DPS in a game where you should be killing most enemies in a single shot is completely nonsensical, this does match the rifle's respective traits. The XM is a bolt action and has a default mag size of 5, while the ES is a semi-auto rifle with a mag size of 20, making it super spammable, leading to really high DPS. In addition, seeing as how the damage values don't change when you increase your magazine capacity, I'm assuming the game looks at its default value. This seems to also be true for the other weapon categories. For example, the KTR has the lowest listed damage value of the 7.62 secondaries because of its low rate of fire and puny default mag capacity, while the similarly chambered AKA-47, someone reads TV tropes, is a fair bit higher because it shoots faster and has a larger mag. As for the pistols, the Garrett M9 chambered in 9mm has a higher listed damage stat than the M1984 chambered in 45 because it again shoots much faster and has a larger mag. Of course, there's still a few odd exceptions to this rule because life is pain. In order to see how much damage you really are doing, you'll need to hover over the ammo type or refer to the workbench page where the more sensical values can be found. There, you'll see that 338 does indeed deal more damage than 7.62 and 45 deals more damage than 9mm, as they should, and so on. However, to further complicate matters, as I was testing damage values, I swear to God, the damage models are finicky or something because I sometimes could not get a consistent number of shots to kill on some enemies. For example, take this grunt marked by 2 chevrons. More on this later. Long story short, you can one-shot them to the chest with a 338, which you cannot do with 7.62, until the game decides not to, and I was never able to one-shot them in the upper back. After some more odd bullshit, I threw in the towel and didn't bother to test the exact shots to kill for secondaries and sidearms. But from what I can gather from a tier 2 shotgunner and a tier 1 heavy, 338 is indeed more powerful as the bar suggests, so I hope I can assume that would also apply to other ammo types. To be perfectly clear though, I'm solely analyzing this for the sake of science and truth. All these little issues are 100% avoidable as long as you go for headshots, which isn't hard. I only started suffering when I was intentionally playing suboptimally. Trust me, I played this game for more than 100 hours and only discovered this recently. Okay, are we all on the same page now? I sure fucking hope so. Now for the special ammo. Perhaps the best kind is the luring round. As the name implies, you simply fire it close to an enemy and it'll distract them like a hypercharged luring stone. It's great for getting enemies into more discreet areas if needed, or split up a pair of mooks that you can't get a collateral on. Another one I like to pack are the AP rounds, which obviously improve damage and penetration. I mostly use them to take down tougher foes instead of actually trying to wallbang though. Honestly, I'm not even sure if the latter really works. Taking rounds tag enemies in a 25-meter radius when shot at a surface, with a completely silent impact. Personally, I found the drone to be really all I needed, but if you're feeling particularly anxious about possible enemies inside buildings, they can be useful. Explosive rounds sound fun, but they kinda suck. They'll blow your cover, AP rounds provide an adequate damage boost to take down tougher targets, and they're not even that effective at taking out groups of enemies because of its puny blast radius. Maybe you could use them to take out vehicles, but they appear so infrequently that there's no point in taking them with you. DARPA rounds basically defy the laws of physics to hit exactly where your crosshairs are pointing. Sounds useful, but like I said earlier, unless you're sniping from 400 meters away, which is rare, sniping isn't really hard enough to warrant an advantage like this. Oddly, EMP rounds are exclusive to 50 cal rifles for no clear reason, and frankly, the pairing makes zero sense. I assume the idea of an EMP round is to remotely disable electronic devices like cameras and turrets, but wouldn't that make more sense if you're trying to be subtle? Besides, it's easier, and in the case of cameras, more advantageous to hack them with your drone if you want to remotely disable them. As for the snipers on offer, while there's a good number of them, there's ultimately very little variety in practice, and it can be easy to become complacent. Because rifles of the same caliber deal the same damage, as I've painstakingly established, and they mostly can all use the same scopes depending on their country of origin, the main things that will set them apart are whether or not they can use a bipod, which is still most of them, a suppressor, anything not chambered in 50 cal, their rate of fire, and magazine size, which dictates your total ammo. And seeing as how a higher rate of fire allows for easier follow-up shots, suppressors are needed to stay as quiet as possible, and being able to pack more ammo is always nice. Personally, I've always gravitated towards the Knight 110, an early semi-auto 7.62 rifle with a healthy mag size for the majority of my playthroughs. It can't equip a bipod, but that never bothered me much. I also like to think I'm generally a decent enough shot to not need to fall back on the extra damage the other rounds have. Speaking of complacency, now's a good time to talk about one of the DLC weapons, the Macmillan TAC 338. Simply put, this rifle kind of breaks the game's intended progression. Normally, as you complete missions, you'll gradually unlock more and more powerful scopes of the NATO variety. Flying in the face of that, the Macmillan can be used right away, and it comes with a proprietary scope that goes up to 21 times. It isn't until you finish the first mission of Act 2 when you unlock a stronger 24 times scope. I'm not necessarily mad or annoyed since it makes the main selling point of the game just a little bit easier right off the bat, but it does feel a touch dirty to use something that's almost pay to win, even in a single player game. The only other rifles that feel like they're worth a mention are the aforementioned ES-25, basically the Knight's bigger brother, the Dragoon, the Russian equivalent, the BSS, and its 338 sibling, the Vikop. The latter two have integrated suppressors that won't degrade. I'll talk more about this later. Before we move on, I do want to talk about the 50 cal rifles because they're sort of in their own class. I have mixed feelings on them. On one hand, you can't suppress them, and the only special ammo they can use are EMP and DARPA rounds, so for the longest time I believed that they were too impractical for the game and wrote them off. However, after some tests, I learned that they're only audible up to around 140 meters, which is still short enough to make most vantage points viable. So basically, you trade off some of your versatility for easier one-shot kills. Personally, I like being able to close the gap with my sniper if I need to, and luring rounds are very useful, so even after learning more about 50 cals, they aren't my first choice, but they're certainly not useless. Let's talk about the bullet cams. If I had to compare it to a pizza, it's like that monstrous microwavable thing that Ashens ate.
Absolutely nauseating.
To be blunt, they're awful. I'm gonna be harsh, because even if this is CI we're talking about, they still look horribly dated for something in a 2017 game. The only reasons why I kept them on was because 1, pizza, and 2, I kinda have a soft spot for the sounds. I disabled them after a while though, since I was getting pretty sick of them and wanted to save a bit of time. Otherwise, the cinematography is rather bland. I guess the bullet looks okay enough in flight, but the impacts suck. They awkwardly jump cut to a different angle on impact, the blood splat is still somewhat anemic, and the death animations, I suppose they have merit in that they feel more grounded than a pure ragdoll, but oh man, a lot can go wrong with them, and it's all pretty noticeable. The most apparent thing is that the first frame of the animations more often than not have the enemy standing in an upright, relaxed position, gun lowered. So if they aren't already doing that exact thing, the bullet cam will awkwardly force them into it, which frankly looks terrible. This can even create anomalies where the enemy is briefly holding an invisible rifle. Very rarely will it properly use crouched or alert poses. Now for a few rapid fire issues. The firing angle is not taken into account on impact. Sometimes the bullet wound texture falls off their face. Sometimes they seem to end too abruptly, or linger on a falling corpse for too long. The close-ups of the player that we saw in the first 2 SGW games and even enemy front are gone, and when we do see John, what the fuck is this? In the base game, I'm pretty sure that the cams only trigger on lighter separatist goons. They never seem to work on heavies or other factions. I think they can break double kills.
Bruh.
and sometimes they just completely bug out. As if that wasn't weird enough, the exploding head effect from 50 cals or AP rounds are oddly picky. While the effect is decent enough, and it sorta gives it an edge over Sniper Elite's brutal X-rays that don't actually affect the character models, it will only happen if a bullet cam plays. If not, their heads stay intact. I've prattled on for way too long about this, but in summary, the bullet cams are mediocre at best, and cheap jank fests at worst that are honestly kind of unacceptable for the time the game came out. At least they don't fuck with the motion blur. If you'll excuse one more petty gripe, for now, I really hate how you constantly have your rifle in a relaxed stance rather than having it pointed forwards. You can barely appreciate the way it looks, and it feels unnatural to have it return to that position every time you scope out. Even SGW2 had your gun pointed forwards temporarily. Hell, early SGW3 footage had it. That one's on me, Kroby Cat. Because of this, it's a real shame that these are the only guns you can apply camos to. By the way, the variety of camos is just incredible. You've got plenty to unlock and purchase, with them ranging from rather tasteful to, well...
3, 2, 1, go!
The stealth has seen quite a few changes from CI's last few games. The first thing you'll notice is that instead of using a single universal detection meter like Crisis, SGW3 now uses the exact same type of meters as, you guessed it, Far Cry. I personally like this style more, since I can focus more on what's in front of me rather than keeping my eyes glued to the minimap. In terms of the AI itself, I'd say it more or less functions exactly as you'd expect modern stealth enemies to behave, so there's not very much I can say beyond the painfully obvious. However, there are actually some pretty neat touches here and there that, while they're not revolutionary, do make things more interesting, and it's kind of impressive that CI thought to include them. For instance, if you manage to raise suspicion in a base while you're sniping, there's a few countermeasures in play to make things a little more challenging. Firstly, enemies will absolutely glue themselves to cover for a good while, so if you want any chance of clearing an area efficiently, you'll need to reposition. And just because enemies haven't fully spotted you, that doesn't mean they can't take a decent guess. As far as I can tell, if you shoot too many times from the same spot, even with a silenced rifle, enemies might be able to estimate where you are and either suppress your spot or even bombard you with mortars to flush you out. So this is all well and good, but contrary to the past titles, it can be a little too forgiving. Obviously, if an enemy fully detects you but then you kill them right away, nobody will be the wiser. That's normal affair, but, and this has happened several times to prove that this isn't a one-off, they can literally fire a few shots and at worst you'll make a nearby enemy investigate, and they won't even be marked as suspicious.
Looks like it's deteriorated ever since.
Hey, what's wrong? You okay? There he is!
I guess if a stealth system's gonna bug out, you might as well do it in a way that doesn't punish and annoy the player, so I'll give it a pass. You'll still need to be quick to kill them anyway. Other new threats include cameras and turrets, both of which are self-explanatory. Cameras will alert the entire outpost if they spot you, and you can disable them either by shooting them, which will also distract a random guard, or by hacking a CCTV box either on foot or remotely with a drone. By doing the latter, you take control of the cameras and can use them to tag enemies. Turrets will obviously shoot you, and like cameras you can either hack them yourself and play a little minigame, or send in your drone. Moving up, takedowns are way better this time around in that they don't take an eternity to complete and feel smoother and actually look somewhat decent. Speaking of which, pardon me while I praise these animations for a bit. While they're a bit scrappy and floaty and some actually do look or sound bad, The choreography itself is pretty interesting for at least some of the moves, and there's a pretty decent variety depending on what angle you attack them from and whether they're standing, crouched, or prone. So, oddly, these have more effort put into them than the main selling point. There's actually potential here. Furthermore, unlike Far Cry where you normally need to unlock them, you can do takedowns from above and below, as well as chain 2 together at the most by pressing W, A, S, or D according to the arrows that appear on screen by default. In addition, you also have the option to interrogate an enemy if you approach them from directly behind, which may give you intel like enemy positions, where supplies are, CCTV boxes, mission critical info, or just nothing at all. Because I still have to discuss these things, the interrogation animation you'll normally see, where John puts Amuka in the world's most awkward chokehold followed by an unsatisfying punch, is kind of a joke. It looks janky, is a mess of obvious clipping issues, and the enemy voice acting is usually abysmal because they just sound bored as hell.
Start talking.
I'm not fucking telling you anything.
The one on the rare prone enemy is actually okay though. Word of warning. While this is extremely rare, as in it only happened during one side mission, interrogations may bug out and make John hug an enemy for eternity, soft-locking the game. I'm not sure what causes this, but heads up I guess. Lastly for CQC, you've got a small selection of knives. They're barely cosmetic and are kinda pointless. Alongside your standard luring rock, you've also got objects like generators and radios you can either interact with or shoot to distract an enemy. Oddly, you won't get any XP from this unlike other tools, but this method seems to distract enemies for much longer. An almost interesting feature is the silencer durability mechanic, which seems to be a unique spin on weapon durability. Firing with the suppressor equipped will gradually degrade it, as shown by a meter on your HUD, until it breaks and you have an unsuppressed weapon in your hands. On paper, I like this idea. By limiting how many suppressed shots you can take, it could promote improvisation and force you to employ different tools and tactics to preserve them, or deal with the fact that you no longer have a quiet gun. However, this is squandered for two reasons. Firstly, missions simply aren't long enough, nor are there enough enemies in an area to even come close to breaking a suppressor if you're good at aiming. On average, I maybe only used up to a third of my sniper suppressor's durability, and that's if I didn't use my sidearm or secondary to infiltrate and get the stragglers. And second, it's too easy to fix them. In your safe house, you just need to pay a small fee to completely restore it, and money is abundant, and out in the field, you can carry up to 5 silencer repair kits, which again, you purchase with money and near instantly fix them on the fly. So even if you run into a big enough base or you wasted a lot of shots, you've essentially got 5 spares in your pocket. So in practice, this whole idea is so easy to work around that it's entirely redundant. On the topic of sound, you can actually see how loud you're being on the minimap, as designated by a pulsing red circle that appears when you move, jump, or fire weapons, even suppressed ones, so be careful. While it's unwise to keep your eyes glued to it, it's a pretty good point of reference to determine what you can and can't do, provided you're not colorblind. As for your firearms, there's plenty of pistols on offer, but what you pack generally seems to matter even less than what sniper you bring. Seeing as how you'll likely be using them to pop a few heads at close range, you'll really be fine with just about any of them. There are some differences between the volume of some suppressed pistols. For example, the starting M1984's radius barely exceeds the player icon, while the M9's goes out to a couple of meters or so, but it's still so small that I highly doubt it'll make or break your stealth runs. If I had to pick some favorites, I'd either pick the aforementioned Garrett M9, the Wagram 21, or the SP M23. The M9 is a very early unlock, has a high fire cap and mag size, which means more ammo in total. The Wagram is unlocked further down the line from main missions, and it has all the qualities of the M9, but it's chambered in 45, which means a bit more damage. And it's a Glock, and I like Glocks. And as for the M23, it's unlocked even later after a side mission, and it's the only pistol that can equip a sight, which is kinda cool. But again, your choice of sidearm should, in practice, essentially be cosmetic. The only one I consider to be questionable is the revolver. It's somewhat powerful, but its usefulness drops off against enemies that can't reliably be one-shot, you can't carry much ammo for it, and practically speaking, I don't understand why you'd sacrifice what's arguably your most useful close-quarter stealth weapon. If you still want to go full frontal, one of the many secondaries may prove to be more sensible. Also, pistols let you move faster and consume less stamina when you sprint, so that's nice. Another new feature is hiding spots, like closets and dumpsters, either for you or bodies. It's a good idea on paper and it works fine enough, but I rarely found a need for it in the field. For corpses, enemies enemy patrols aren't going to scour every nook and cranny, so you don't have to be this careful, and there's nothing a good bush can't hide. I only did it for a bit of XP. As for hiding yourself, it is effective, but more often than not, I prefer to continue to pick off enemies rather than wait. And even then, again, sometimes a bush is all you need. By the way, you'll know you're concealed when your stance indicator turns black. But there comes a time where you may need to make some noise. After being absent in the last game, assault-oriented guns make a return to the series, and fine. In terms of the feel, it isn't unbearable trash, but it doesn't feel quite smooth enough to really be good. It's a bit sluggish and stiff, and I even think Enemy Front's basic run-of-the-mill shooting feels a touch better. You've got a decent selection of assault rifles, shotguns, bows, and even an LMG, and unlike the snipers and pistols, they mostly feel different enough so your choice isn't virtually cosmetic, mostly due to the varying rates of fire and recoil patterns, although minor balance issues are still present. On the whole, the automatic weapons are mostly hampered by hefty recoil, weapon sway, which gets worse when you're being shot at, and bullet spread, some more than others, but ultimately, they get the job done about 80% as well as you'd expect, and they don't make me grimace so hard that my face implodes. Generally, they're also the most customizable secondaries, allowing you to attach sights, different magazines, suppressors, and either a laser or a flashlight provided the weapon is able to. They also come with a select fire feature. The magazines are kinda where the balance issue lies, which I also alluded to earlier. While I suppose it's not a big deal since they are largely meant to be backup weapons, because you're given 3 or 4 magazines worth of ammo rather than a set number of rounds, some rifles will end up having comically deep ammo pools while others are left in the dust. Suppressors obviously mean that some of your secondaries can become viable stealth weapons. While I personally still use pistols more often out of habit and desire to get ghost XP, suppressed ARs, or LMG if you fancy, are good for panic spraying and earning warrior XP while still staying under the radar. Lastly, quick comment on the lasers and flashlights. Normally after you stop sprinting, the game insists on leaving your gun in a lowered position, which can contribute to the subpar feel. Turning these attachments on will mitigate it, assuming the gun can equip one. My personal favorite secondaries are the Herstal, an assault rifle with good handling characteristics and access to a 120 round drum mag, or the FM3000UM, which can carry 250 rounds in a single pouch. The shotguns are actually surprisingly potent, having good damage and pretty decent range, provided you stick to buckshot. You can switch between buck and slugs on the fly, and they are kinda terrible. As far as I can tell, they seem to be less capable of one-shotting enemies, especially tougher ones, contrary to the damage stats, though spread and sway make them quite hard to shoot accurately, especially when you're being shot at, which nullifies any range advantage. Buck is just better and easier to use overall. If you need more range, just use something else. Unfortunately, the shotguns are hit the hardest by the way your total ammo is calculated. The pump action OFM and the semi-auto Giovanni only allow you to carry 24 or 32 shells respectively, while the drum mag fed Orange and 12, easily the best shotgun in the game, sits pretty with 120, which doesn't feel fair. It's not like the former two are any more powerful if the damage stats are anything to go by. The only exception to this is the double barrel for obvious reasons. Speaking of which, here's an interesting bit of trivia. The DB used to occupy the sidearm slot, which gave it a somewhat interesting role, albeit not a super practical one in my opinion. At some point, however, it was moved to the secondary slot, so now it's just a 2-shot shotgun that doesn't fill any niche. Unlike most double barrels, it doesn't appear to have better damage nor range. If you're looking for another stealth option, you've also got 2 bows on offer. The recurve bow, which is a late unlock from a weapon crate, or its DLC counterpart, the compound bow, which you can use immediately. I guess they're alright. Provided you stick to barbed head arrows, which are like flatheads but not total garbage, you should be able to get silent one-shot kills to the upper body and higher, but sometimes it's inexplicably inconsistent. More so with the compound bow, which the game tries to tell you is more powerful, I've had a lot of 2-shot kills. I assume it's either because of picky damage models or simply the fact that I'm much more comfortable with the recurve bow's sights. You also can't use either of them while prone. Because of those issues, I personally would rather use a normal suppressed gun, but to be fair, when they do work, they are pretty satisfying. your mileage may vary. Of course, if you're going loud, you're gonna need some meds, and SGW3 gives you 3 types of healing items. Adrenaline shots heal 1 chunk of health by default, but they're fast and you can run while using them. Pills heal 2, take a little longer, and you can only walk while you heal. Finally, medkits will heal 3 chunks, but it takes the longest and you won't be able to move while the animation plays. I suppose this is kind of an interesting idea, but I don't feel like it adds a whole lot in practice. I assume the intent was to make you strategize a little with your resources, but frankly, I just hit the heal button whenever my health was low, not really paying attention to what I had equipped, and wasn't any worse off for it, mostly because I had the skill that improves the effects of meds. Finally, armor works exactly as you'd expect, and you gradually unlock more durable versions as you progress through the game. Before we move on, it's important to note that pretty much all of my combat footage was taken after I upgraded my health, meds, and armor. Otherwise, you're pretty squishy, so it's gonna be a bad time if you're trying to go loud like this from the start. At the risk of sounding biased, it's clearly meant to be a last resort tactic and frankly is nowhere near as satisfying as being stealthy. Anyway, now that we've gone over all 3 weapon classes, I'll touch on their sounds and animations because that matters for some reason. The animation quality varies between each category and it's mediocre overall. Somehow, I feel like they're a bit of a downgrade from CI's last 2 games. The sniper rifle reloads are extremely lazy, being very static and having most of the action take place off screen, with a few exceptions that still aren't special. Most of the pistols actually have a decent reload, as in almost all of them use the exact same animation. In addition, the slides move extremely slowly when you fire, which just makes them feel weird. Enemy front got this right, so what happened? The secondaries are overall serviceable enough, but they very much teeter on the line between natural and too stiff with very basic choreography. The sounds are equally a bit of a mixed bag. Here's the funny thing. The guns that you'd want to use for stealth, the snipers and pistols, have really nice unsuppressed sounds with a good amount of punch and reverb that wraps around your head, especially the former. However, once you slap a can on them, all the beefiness is gone and you're left with incredibly boneless mouse farts. On the flip side, the secondary's loud gunshots don't sound quite as good to me. But when they're suppressed, it actually sounds like there's still some oomph behind them. Funny how that works out. However, before you go ahead and fire these guns with reckless abandon, you may want to do some recon work with your drone. It's as easy as skimming the outposts and taking pretty much everyone in your field of view and hacking cameras and turrets if you need to. In addition, you can equip it with up to 4 upgrades, with the best ones in my opinion being the battery upgrades, stealth upgrades, hacking, and thermal vision. One nice thing I've noticed is that usually, if you reload a checkpoint during a mission or die while you're clearing an outpost, the game will save your tags so you don't have to waste so much time doing recon again. Great quality of life feature. In addition to the repair kits I mentioned earlier, SGW3 has plenty of gadgets on offer, but I'll only dig deeper into the more noteworthy ones that actually give me a decent amount of stuff to talk about. I'm sure you know how stuff like frags, mines, flashes, and gas function already. Of all of these, I only found minimal use for the latter 2 and never used the former even during loud runs. Perhaps the most useful gadget in my opinion are the thermal vision goggles. While they're a late unlock, they're perfect for improving your target acquisition and counteracting the game's murky visuals at a distance. Alongside that, you've also got night vision, but it's laughably useless. The game is rarely dark enough to warrant using them, and when it is, it just tints your screen green, which doesn't help your vision in the slightest. Making a return from the first game, we've got throwing knives again, and simply put, I just don't like them at all. I suppose they're fine with dealing with weak enemies and are 100% silent, but the moment I try to use them against tier 2 enemies, their effectiveness falters quickly. I have never been able to kill them with a single knife throw. Either the lock-on refuses to guide my knife directly to their head, even when the crosshair is in the correct spot, or they have just enough HP to tank it. Either way, you're better off using literally anything else. On top of that, the XP gain isn't even worth the effort. A throwing knife kill will net you 50 XP for all trees, while headshots with a secondary, sniper, or sidearm will grant you 85 warrior XP, 95 sniper XP, or 180 ghost XP respectively. A pretty novel gadget is the decoy trap, a remotely triggered distraction device. Honestly, unless you're making some kind of elaborate trap with mines, I guess, instead of just shooting the mooks, this is basically a luring stone with a far shorter throwing distance and extra steps. Another sort of unique but ultimately not that useful gadget is the warning device, which tags enemies if they walk near it. I'm usually able to tag every enemy in an outpost, and if they try to rush my position, I'd rather just relocate. As one would expect in a typical Ubisoftian open world game, and after previous mentions of it, SGW3 has skill Shrubs. Cute title drop aside, this is probably one of the saddest upgrade systems I've ever seen, in both its presentation and impact on the player. It is still better than a Levid though. How it works is very simple. You earn XP for each shrub by performing actions that are assigned to one of the three. So obviously sniper kills for sniper, sidearm kills, takedowns, or hiding bodies for ghost, and secondary kills or takedowns from the front for warrior. On top of that, actions like tagging enemies or finding fast travel points give you universal experience that gets applied to all shrubs. Every 1000 XP you earn in a category, you get a skill point. First tier skills need 2 points, second tier skills need 4, third tier skills need 8, and you need at least 2 skills to unlock the next tier. So, there's a few things at play that make this all feel pretty slapdash. Firstly, some of the skills don't really have a clear connection to their respective groups. For example, echolocation allows you to see footsteps and chatter through walls in scout mode. Sounds like something you'd use during infiltration as a ghost. Nope, it's a sniper skill where that won't matter. What about Hurt Locker, which makes you take 25% less damage from explosives? That's a ghost skill, and I don't need to explain why that doesn't make sense. There's more examples of this haphazard categorization, but to be fair, the warrior tree is more or less fine in this regard. The idea behind this leveling system was clearly do a thing to be better at that thing, but the rewards don't follow suit. Much like extraterrestrial hissy fit, the skills themselves are generally snooze-worthy, and won't really change the way you play. I won't list all of them, but the majority of the 27 skills available are either basic bitch things like more health, stamina, or equipment slots, or almost entirely useless, like reducing the amount of resources needed to craft traps when crafting basically has no use, allowing you to do unlimited chain takedowns when you'll rarely ever come across more than 2 enemies standing close to one another, or giving you unlimited stamina for 20 seconds when you're on your last health chunk when you're likely gonna die anyway. Some of the skills are hideously overvalued. In the sniper tree, one of the tier 3 skills allows you to highlight tagged enemies in scout mode, which is pretty useful for dealing with the muddy visuals at long ranges or preemptively lining up a headshot as you turn a corner. This is considered to be on the same level as reloading your sniper 20% faster. And that unlimited chain kill skill is a tier 3 ability as well, meaning the game considers it to be more important than a skill that makes you walk and jump with less noise. In the ghost tree. Even weirder is that even after you've maxed out a tree, you can still get skill points, but they won't have any use whatsoever. Really, the only suggestion I have is to add skills that are more compelling and worth looking forward to, and maybe present them in a less painfully bland way. The different kinds of XP is a fine idea, but ultimately what we get feels tacked on to keep up appearances. Now, if you'll pardon the crappy segue and disorganized info, I'm going to talk about some other miscellaneous mechanics and features. As I briefly touched upon, this game has a crafting system, and to be blunt, it's absolutely useless. Throughout the game, you can collect explosive parts, bullet heads, mechanical parts, and electronic parts from loot boxes and enemy weapons, which can be used to make ammo and gadgets. You can also get vaguely defined biological substances from wild animals that you use to make meds. Are you sure you want to inject that, John? The main problem with this is that you can just buy everything with your money, which is far more abundant, rendering this whole system obsolete. There's nothing unique that you can make with crafting either. I pretty much went this whole playthrough without collecting many resources, and what I did collect I never crafted, and I never fell short on anything. There's also a weird glitch where the game just gives you free ammo if you're completely empty just by accessing your weapon cache. I don't get it. It would have been somewhat interesting to have to manage various currencies or use materials to repair things like suppressors and armor, which makes far more sense, but as it stands, just ignore it. I also mentioned Scout Mode, or We Have Witcher Sense in Georgia earlier on. By holding left control by default, you'll be able to highlight things such as loot, hiding spots, mines, recommended sniping spots, climbable ledges, and clues, which mostly exist as glorified interactions or optional breadcrumb activators. You can also tag nearby enemies with it as well. Not much else to say. It exists, kinda wish it was toggled. Speaking of climbable ledges, SGW3 has a light parkour system that allows you to grab onto designated spots, which are thoughtfully plentiful for the most part, on rock surfaces, buildings, railings, etc., and you can climb up or down, shimmy left or right, or leap off. It's pretty responsive and can allow you to forge your own path through certain areas and get different angles on enemies. But unfortunately, this is kinda like the Quake 2 of parkour systems. Seems alright on paper, technically works in practice, but it feels so slow and clunky. Every time you're climbing ledges, there's a very short but noticeable delay before you start to grab the next one, and when you leap off, it feels like you float in the air for like half a second. Like most of the game, this could use polish, but at least the framework is fine. And I do like it more than Quake 2. SGW3 has a number of enemy types on offer, along with a tier system as designated by what icon they have when tagged. They're about what you'd expect for a modern open world game, although what some of them actually add to the roster is extremely vague. Firstly, you can tell what tier an enemy is just by looking at the amount of chevrons they have. As far as my tests are concerned, this just translates to having more health, which at worst means a loud playstyle will be harder, and stuff like throwing knives and bows will be harder to use. It also offers some visual variety. Enemies that just have the chevron are what I like to call grunts. Just your standard baddie, nothing more. I have no idea what the enemies with the rifle icon, or riflemen, are. Aside from the tier 1 riflemen being the thickest men in Georgia, I'm not noticing anything unique about them aside from possibly having more health. That is generally negligible. Also, the tier 2 riflemen appear less armored, but that's not the case. Ones with the gas mask icon, hi, are the shotgunners. They're typically more durable than your standard mooks and are immune to gas attacks as their models would suggest, and they occasionally lob smoke grenades. Starred enemies are what I assume are captains. Like the riflemen, I seriously do not know what they do. Aside from having a bit more health, they don't seem to have an effect on enemy AI, and unlike contracts, you don't get any unique info from them. While I accidentally lost the footage of me interrogating a captain in one mission, I got the exact same info from a random grunt. Trust me. Heavies, designated by a grenade, are almost exactly what you'd expect, except that they go down extremely easily with headshots, even with assault rifles, making them a lot less of a threat than you'd think. One type even has an exposed face from the front, so you can just drop them instantly. At worst, they'll provide a minor roadblock in your stealth, since you can't take them down, you can't move their bodies, and some may have a bulletproof mask that can block at least one sniper shot, but have an obvious weak spot in the back of their head. No points for guessing what the crosshairs represent. Snipers behave exactly as you'd expect, but have a unique detection bar, which is a nice quality of life feature. Finally, a skull refers to these aggressively tactical spoiler enemies that only appear in a few story missions. They have a shit ton of health, needing an AP round or a 50 cal to go down in a single hit, move faster than normal enemies, can switch between using a sniper or an assault rifle, and have heavily distorted radio chatter. However, they still go down pretty easily with melee and don't seem to be any more intelligent. Awkward segue. There's also this Buggy DLC. Buggy, not buggy, that changes your personal vehicle from an SUV to yeah. As far as I'm concerned, this is pretty much just a cosmetic change, since the speed and handling feel identical. Not much else to say, really. Speaking of driving, that leads me to arguably the most contentious part of the whole game, the open world. While it's not without some merit, I've unfortunately come to be a little more negative towards it. The biggest issue plaguing everything is how dead the world is across all 3 regions. It may be pretty, but for the most part there's nothing going on. Villages feel more like wax museums rather than something that really feels alive.
Welcome, welcome. What do you need?
Enemies are relegated to outposts or points of interest, so unless you run into a roadblock or a camp that's really close to the road, there are 0 roaming enemies to keep you on your toes during your lengthy commutes. Even if you get spotted, you can drive away and they won't be able to chase you. I once found the drives to be relaxing sightseeing moments, but eventually I started to get a little tired of them. I wonder why. It's basically padding. There's also a notable lack of friendly NPCs that fight alongside you, so there aren't any dynamic emergent fights going on like Far Cry. I suppose it's not too bad considering the stealth focus, but without the ambiance of random skirmishes, the world doesn't feel as dangerous as it should. Unlike the pre-release footage, there's no dynamic weather. As far as I'm concerned, like I said earlier, stuff like rain and blizzards only occur a handful of times during missions. At best, the wind might be stronger, but you neither see nor hear it. It just makes everything feel even more static. There's little incentive to try to clear outposts and the points of interest. The former is because they eventually will repopulate with enemies, usually if you reload the game, and yes, this is literally an intended feature, not a bug. At least it makes testing stuff really easy. A lot of them are also tied to certain missions, so you might as well wait until they're available to play them. I enjoy the gameplay, but I don't want to play the same outpost twice in such a short period of time. Unless you need XP, save it. Points of interest have varying degrees of quality and or worthwhileness. Some are fast travel points to make your commute shorter, which is utterly invaluable. After that, there's the ones that give you new weapons, scopes of the Russian variety, and camos. Even if the weapons you find aren't necessarily better than the ones you unlock by playing missions or taking from enemies, they're arguably the most rewarding feeling collectible to find. Doubly so if you need to do a minor drone navigation puzzle. They're nothing crazy, but it's a good idea. Unfortunately, these are also mixed with the ones that ultimately feel pointless. You've got your typical modern Ubisoftian collectibles that exist to tick boxes, and give you a little bit of money that's already in large supply, like relics and old rifles that you can't even use. Isn't that actually a good thing though? Do you really want to use a Mosin Nagant and apply stars and stripes to it? Of course you do. There's hostage situations where you need to clear out a small group of enemies in order to free some civilians. Aside from giving you some money and XP from the kills, there's no real incentive. Most wanted targets are basically just named NPCs, and can range from being part of an actual mission, a pseudo side quest with a decent outpost or area that actually feels worth your time to clear, or a dinky little area that isn't very interesting. Like the above, the only reward is money and XP. The ones that feel like the biggest waste of time are almost entirely just crafting supplies that may or may not have some environmental storytelling tacked on. You don't need the supplies because crafting is completely pointless, and the stories being told are usually some variation of, "Yep, they died." More like points of uninterest, am I right? I had actually 100%ed this game in the past, twice because of who I was as a person, but for this playthrough, I only cleared just enough for the video in the interest of time, and I wasn't any worse off on resources, nor was I pining for any particular weapon. So objectively speaking, for lack of a better phrase, these really don't add much. The silver lining is that the open world design generally allows for unprecedented freedom and CI's library, making it a way more engaging experience if you have something resembling good taste. Now, considering the sheer amount of both main and side missions, I think it'll be better for all of us, namely your time and my sanity, if I try to group them into different categories and discuss the common traits within them, rather than trying to painstakingly dissect every single one. To get these out of the way as quickly as possible, there are unfortunately a few missions that are based around sitting at one designated spot that you can't really move from in front of a shooting gallery rather than a more free-form deal. At their worst, you'll be told exactly who to shoot and when, and you may fail if you make one mistake. These feel horribly out of place and are distressingly similar to the last game. At best, it's simple bubble wrap gaming, and at worst, they're condescending and suck. There's also some missions that are mostly a single cutscene, driving, or in one case, talking to the horrible looking NPCs with painfully padded conversations that feel like an enormous waste of time.
You know you want it. There's a bed upstairs. Very.
Hurry up! Thankfully, the majority is much better to varying degrees. On the simpler end, while still retaining a good amount of agency, you've got the missions that focus on rather small outposts like this gas station, this sawmill, or this little camp, or moderately sized villages. These tend to be surrounded by really nice places to snipe from, only that the game isn't necessarily forcing you into any specific spot like those other ones. If things go a touch south, you've generally got enough space to reposition or shake off enemies. And obviously, you can infiltrate the area from basically any angle and take whatever path you may need on the inside to complete your objective and or kill everyone, and generally go at your own pace. I know I'm listing pretty obvious things here, but keep in mind that CI didn't pull off anything this dynamic before, so gold star. I don't think they're really worthy of any kind of in-depth analysis, but overall, they're solid enough. Things can get a little more interesting as outpost security and or size increase. Even some relatively small ones can be equipped with cameras and or turrets, so you'll have to approach them accordingly. It's a surprisingly rewarding feeling to sneak your way to a CCTV terminal, either on foot or with your drone. The larger, more base-like areas are also fairly impressive. The previous comments concerning agency and finding your own path apply, except on a grander scale. If you're observant or adventurous enough, you may be rewarded with shortcuts to make your job much easier. I really wish missions were replayable so that I'd actually have more of an incentive to try and find more. Just playing them as outposts without an actual objective doesn't hit quite the same. Okay, there are a few areas that I'll spotlight, mostly so this section isn't just a blanket statement cop-out. The first one that comes to mind is the Horizon Hotel in the Mining Town region, tied to an early side mission and a late main mission. Much of my previous comments apply. As you tackle your objectives, you'll be faced with a good mix of long-range engagements and CQC stealth, with decent vantage points to snipe from, and there's a number of ways to infiltrate the hotel. One that I find pretty cool, because I'm an easily impressed man-child, is this neat roof entrance that allows you to silently access the same floor your target's on in the side mission. The research facility you need to tackle during a mission in Act 3 really showcases the potential of the open-world sniping game concept. Just for funsies and personal challenge, I decided to post up in an area nearly 400 meters away that isn't even marked out or suggested to you unless you're near it, and provides a mostly clear line of sight of pretty much everyone inside. While sniping was obviously a bit more challenging, the mooks weren't even able to suppress my location, let alone spot me. So basically, stuff like this rewards both open world exploration and good aim. I also appreciate the placements of the CCTV terminals. They're kind of in places that would be risky to approach on foot, so you'll need to use your drone. Another interesting mission is the first one in Act 2, where all of your equipment has either been replaced or outright temporarily removed, including your drone, and you need to tackle a small village without much of the advantages you'd normally have. Admittedly, I did mess up here, went loud, and didn't bother to restart, and because I can't replay missions, I can't provide anything super in-depth here. It sounded like a good idea at the time, okay? Nevertheless, it's still a good idea for a mission, and you still have room to move around. There's also this rocket base that's part of a side mission and houses a most wanted target. There's a really good vantage point right across that may not immediately be obvious that allows you to plink away at a bunch of guards. If you miss it and decide to go in on foot, you could still use the base's verticality to your advantage. There's also a nice amount of space to move around on the inside, although it does bring up one flaw that's somewhat recurrent. Some of the larger bases have very low enemy density, so all this room is kinda wasted. Much like the open world at large. You'll see this problem arise as soon as the 4th mission of Act 1 in this chonker of a satellite base. It's the first large outpost you encounter, but the enemy placements make it really easy to kill mooks without having to worry one bit about good timing or patrols, and a good portion of them are far away from your objectives, so they're easily ignored. So big won't always mean better, but I'd much rather play something like this instead of any of SGW2's brain-dead shit, so these instances at least scrape by with a solid C+. Now, as if SGW3 wasn't big enough, we've got 2 DLC expansions to cover. You're still with me, right? The first one is the Escape of Lydia, an extremely short campaign consisting of literally 2 missions that reuse locations from the base game, specifically the village map. It's a prequel that very slightly expands on Lydia's backstory, like you actually care. She crippled her general and his son wants revenge, so she needs to kill him first. The first mission, The Trace, reuses this outpost. Because of its somewhat close quarter layout and where you spawn, essentially at the bottom of a hill, you'll be doing more infiltration type work rather than finding a vantage point and plinking. You've got a handful of paths and buildings you can climb and jump on to traverse the village and get the drop on enemies, although there's only one staircase you can take to approach the officer you need to interrogate. Ideally, you'd want to take the subtle approach and do that, but if you alert any enemy, you'll need to kill him before he can escape via helicopter and loot his corpse. It's rehashed content, but at least they took a decent outpost.
This looks really nice.
On the other hand, the next and last mission, The Hunt, is just underwhelming as piss. The mission boils down to kill 5 guys at a roadblock, steal a buggy, drive because he didn't do that enough in the main game, kill 5 guys on a hill, shoot the main target from 500 meters away, done. No interesting level design to even gloss over. If you ignored the most wanted target residing in that village in the main game, you could argue this is new content you haven't played before, but I mean, let's not even pretend to kiss up. Escape of Lydia is a cheap, no-effort cash grab that you should only own as a part of the Season Pass edition. Even if the gameplay is still fine, it's hard to justify paying $3 for a half hour of content you can basically do for free in the main campaign and listening to the brunt of Lydia's awful voice acting.
What happened? Oh, shit! Incoming! You have a problem? Do you want one?
The same cannot be said about the Sabotage. Released about 5 months post-launch, it's a much more fulfilling expansion, consisting of a handful of missions set in a new, relatively smaller, but still open world. Unfortunately, this is all I can really say about it without spoiling the main story's twist, since it's a prequel that actually directly ties into it. The story's kinda reviled by most people, but if you care, here's a timestamp to skip this section. Ready to get caught up? Okay. So like I said before, John's merrily policing the separatist movement, and eventually he and his team are about to make a move against the enemy leaders as one of them is being wed, before an assassin beats them to the punch and kills one of them before quickly getting sniped himself. After doing some sleuthing around the area, he finds the place where the unknown sniper was and soon finds their fancy helmet labeled with the name Armazi. This Armazi then shoots it clean out of his hands. We're told he's some kind of urban legend and practically a superhuman sniper. We later learned that Armazi is part of a powerful secret organization called the 23 Society, who has been helping the separatists with their cause to cover up their real goal of making nukes in an old facility in Georgia. They're basically the Illuminati, or the real world police. After raiding a military base that was presumed to have 23S related intel, John comes face to face with Armazi himself, who then reveals that he's actually none other than his long lost younger brother Robert, now leading an elite army of aggressively tactical 23S super soldiers much like himself.
I am one ghost warrior among many. Ghost warrior.
To make a brief comment on the twist here, I've seen people say it sucked and that they saw it coming a mile away. Personally, while I can't say I have a real opinion on it since I can't even recall my initial reaction from like 4 years ago, I will say that at least it is foreshadowed, unlike Maddox's betrayal in the last game, like you remember that. I mean, Robert was a sniper, or Mozzie is a sniper, Robert was said to be in Georgia after being kidnapped by a guy who was later revealed to have ties with 23S. I don't know. I don't hate it. You can probably see where I'm going with this. The Sabotage, vaguely, covers Robert's induction into the 23 Society and his transformation into Mozzie by the hands of Sergei Flostov, a scientist and a 23S founder. Brief tangent. Something I find kind of interesting is that we learned about Flostov's true side in the main story after John was fooled into thinking that he was merely a victim from none other than the protagonist of SGW2, Cole Anderson, now horribly mutilated.
John? Cole? Hey, kid. I should have figured you'd come for it.
Yep, that about sums up how I feel about that fucking game now. Over the course of the year between his abduction and the start of the DLC, Robert was apparently subjected to unexplained brainwashing and I assume other bodily enhancements. The straw that broke the camel's back was the death of his wife, Mila North. She was murdered by Flostov, but he tricked Robert into believing that she died due to an American drone strike, making him turn against his country. All of which hilariously and anticlimactically deflates the very instant John tells him the truth at the end of the main game.
There's never been a US drone strike in Congo. Vostok kidnapped and poisoned her himself. All this is just to break you. He calls such an event the Pillar. I can prove it, Rob. Sergei?
He's trying to manipulate you. Robert North is dead.
Is it true?
You are Mozzie of the 23 Society, and
Is it
together
true?
Yes. The death was a necessary evil. We had to free you from your old life.
Sent to Georgia, Robert is tasked with destabilizing the government to help give the separatists, who are now friendly and actually shown in a sympathetic light, the push they need to have the amount of power they'll eventually have in John's campaign in order to allow 23 Society to get a foothold in the region. Now, as for the gameplay, it's a bite-sized version of the base game but with significantly better pacing overall. Firstly, player progression is a lot less padded out. While the original drip-fed equipment to you over the course of its few dozen missions in the Sabotage, you immediately have a variety of weapons, gadgets, armor, drone upgrades, and camos available for purchase or for free. You can even get a 24x scope if you pick up an enemy sniper rifle as early as the first mission. There is less on offer overall, with many things not making a return, but it hardly matters in the grand scheme of things. Skills are also technically less grindy. In lieu of earning skill points with XP, you'll receive a few base game skills worth of player upgrades during each of the 5 story missions as Robert gets these not Far Cry 2 malaria headaches, making them tie nicely into the plot, which is a neat touch. Unfortunately, some of the skills feel like they're unlocked too late. For instance, you earn the ability to automatically loot enemies with a takedown near the end of the 4th mission, and you finally move with less noise right before the last mission, which isn't even stealth based. Both of which are skills that you likely would have unlocked within the first third of the main game. Still though, it does feel nicer to consistently get skills that actually feel beneficial to you, rather than needing to grind to buy useless skills just to gain access to the better ones. Because the map is a lot smaller, you'll also spend less time driving. There's still no enemies during your commutes, but the ratio between that and actual gameplay is much better. Points of interest are still generally not worth doing, but at least there's less of them to overwhelm you and bloat the map. But there's at least one that's pretty good. It's another one of the ones that needs your drone, but this one requires more finesse to avoid hazards in event, as well as some speed since you'll need to find and hack 3 things before your battery runs out. The reward's fairly hefty too, giving you both an ES-25 and a Wagram, which were originally unlocked in later missions, so that's really nice. The most wanted targets are almost less interesting this time around. There's only 3, with one of them being part of a side quest and the other 2 in small outposts, if you can even call them that. While there's only a handful of missions and their corresponding outposts, I'd say they're all about on the same level as what the main game had to offer, minus all the ones that felt too small and simple. They've got all the same hallmarks, surrounded by vantage points, various points of entry, and a sense of agency, but generally seem to have better enemy density. There's also one area that contains 3 outposts in close proximity, and in the 2 missions that use them, you're free to engage them in any order you want. In addition, 2 outposts you raid during missions will permanently become friendly separatist bases. The second one's a real shame because I really enjoyed the vantage points in its somewhat complex interior, and I wish I could replay it to get a better analysis. They've mostly done away with the bland SGW2 mission design crap too, so that makes it even better. The only one that's not really my speed is the final mission, where it's more of a loud wave defense rather than a more freeform stealthy affair, but at least I don't feel like I'm being talked down to. Being a story about becoming a 23S super soldier, you'll also have access to some fancy new gear. That's rather disappointing. First of all, you unlock them as soon as you finish the penultimate mission, which kinda doesn't leave you much content left to actually play around with them, unless you want to dick around in the post-game. And secondly, while they are nice to have, they don't live up to the hype. The 23S helmet is just a combination of an enemy highlighting rangefinder, which is useless since you unlock the ability to see tagged enemies through walls in scout mode, night vision goggles, and thermal vision, both of which you already have as separate gadgets. Nothing really special. The armor gives you the noise reduction and a total of 5 bars of armor, as opposed to the heavy armor's 3. The former bonus is a good but mundane one that again is unlocked too late to feel special, and the latter is only really useful during the final mission, which is mostly loud. Even if it was given earlier, you don't really need it if you're good at staying undetected. The most interesting but still kinda underwhelming addition is the fancy 23S rifle that you originally couldn't obtain, the Shrubs 5.0. Its good qualities consist of a totally rad design that I decided to ruin, being semi-auto, and having a magazine size of 30, which means it has plenty of reserve ammo. The bad news? The scope isn't as powerful as one might hope, maxing out at 21 when you likely have the 24x scope already, and it's a 50 cal. The Shrubs is such a missed opportunity, it gives me blue balls. Aside from being the most spammable 50 cal in the game, there's nothing in terms of its function that makes it special. Don't get me wrong, it's still powerful and is basically the ultimate I don't give a fuck sniper, but there's so many other things they could have done. The scope could be stronger, zooming and adjusting for elevation could be much faster, they could have given it an integrated suppressor to make it more viable for stealth and the only suppressed 50 cal, they could have given it more ammo types, or, and this would have been super cool, the assault rifle mode that we saw in the main game. That way you'd have a kick-ass, versatile sniper that can convert into a secondary in a snap. Even if I keep saying that you generally shouldn't go loud, that would have been something to talk about. As it stands, it's outperformed by the ES-25 in terms of versatility, at least for how I like to approach the game. Underwhelming equipment aside, the Sabotage is a worthwhile short and sweet mission pack, provided you enjoyed the main game. It doesn't do anything super new, but if you're pining for some more SGW3 content, it'll basically offer all the best parts of the original while trimming away most of the padding. If nothing else, it's at least better than Escape of Lydia. Maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm stupid, maybe I'm too nice. But despite all my gripes, I don't care what the detractors say. Underneath the dead, vapid open world, half-baked ideas, painful development, and inevitable lack of polish, Sniper Ghost Warrior 3 is still an enjoyable game that no doubt blows every single one of their past titles out of the water, with mechanics that feel much more intuitive and natural and ample space to engage with them. Rose-tinted goggles aside, I swear I can sense CI's passion and desire to improve, even if the final product is rickety. The bad is mostly outweighed by the core gameplay of stealth and sniping and non-handholdy open-ended areas, which is just solid, simple fun. It has a certain feel, atmosphere, and satisfaction that stuff like Far Cry, Ghost Recon Wildlands, and, dare I say it, Sniper Elite just can't match. Look, it just appeals to me on so many levels, I can't help it. Even if Contracts has arguably rendered it obsolete, for less than $5 Canadian for just the standard version during sales, I'd say it's a pretty decent bang for your buck if you have the patience for it. And once again, with absolute certainty, it's easily one of my biggest guilty pleasures, and if what you've seen intrigues you, then hey, maybe it could be one of yours as well. Anyway, see you in a year!